TikTok, time to rock. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's watching from all over the world. It's your friendly neighborhood philosopher here, D. Wood. And with me now, I've got someone who was one of the few people who was doing this before I was. I remember it felt like back in 2008, 2009, it was a pretty lonely world as far as criticizing Islam and talking about what jihad calls for. So you were now there's tons of people doing it. Fortunately, there are tons of people going after the sources of Islam and so on. But back then it was a lonely world. So you were one of the pioneers. Now, to be fair, we know that there were people many generations ago who were dealing with Islam. But as far as like the modern period, no one wanted to touch Islam for a long time because you'd get blasted by everyone. If you started criticizing Islam, you of course got blasted by the keyboard jihadis who are sending you threats and saying we'll kill you and kill your families and all that. And then you get blasted by atheists. If you're a Christian, you get blasted by atheists saying, "Hey, how can you criticize that religion when you're also religious?" But the craziest part was you'd even get blasted by Christians saying you're being unloving by hurting people's feelings about their religion. And so it was a sad, lonely world back in the early 2000s. And yet, Raymond, you were there exposing Islam. So what was it that? Oh, I'm just looking at you right now, and I'm thinking, oh, and not only was he doing this before I was, and before a lot of other people who are doing it now were doing it, he's also the one who's massively more physically imposing than I am.
Hey, David.
Hey, how you doing? So yeah, how'd you
Good.
get into this?
Yeah, so I got into it. The atmosphere you're describing really is the sort of post 9/11, general atmosphere of, what do we make of this Islam thing? Is Islam violent? Is it not? Is it the religion of peace? As George Bush, W. Bush said. And I actually got into this field, ironically. It's kind of interesting because it was my academic focus. In 2000, when I was doing my master's degree in history, my thesis was actually a battle between Muslims and Christians. In fact, one of the first and most pivotal battles, the Battle of Yarmouk in the year 636. And it was under Victor Davis Hanson, who's, a pretty big shot nowadays. He wasn't when I knew him back, 30 years ago. He was, but he's a great guy, mentor, I can say, still a friend that we speak. But anyway, I was in that academic little kind of niche. I was working my languages. If you want to be a historian, you obviously have to know certain languages to access the primary sources. And I was using my Arabic as well as Greek to piece together what was going on with the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire and the Arab Umayyad Caliph, essentially, or even before that, under the Al Rashidun, the first four caliphs, the righteous four caliphs. And that's all I really cared about. I was never arguably until today, not very much interested in the temporal, because it's just, I see it as just, reinforcement, confirmations of the big things that I'm interested in. They're just byproducts of what I do like to study, and they're just confirmations. So when a Muslim goes and stabs and screams Allahu Akbar, I know that's the big news, but it really doesn't interest me because it's just confirmation of the impetus behind it that does interest me. Anyway, so I came from that sort of academic, scholarly, historical, quiet background. After 9/11 and so forth, I went to Georgetown University, which was one of the leading schools dealing with the Middle East. I was at the Center of Contemporary Arab Studies, in fact, where people like, John Esposito and his ilk dominate, and that's their center. But I was, this is me in the late 20s, and I didn't know anything about I didn't understand the whole political correct narrative. And, I just thought we're trying to be scholars and ascertaining the truth and so forth. I was that naive. I really believe that. I learned much more. I learned much to counter that in the subsequent years. During that time, now we're talking about 2002, 2003, I landed a job at the Library of Congress while I was going to Georgetown. In the African and Middle Eastern division. And this was like a dream job for me. I'm something of a bibliophile. Okay, and the Library of Congress is just a beautiful institution. I was at the Jefferson Building. For those who know, there's three buildings. The Jefferson Building is the historical one that tourists go and visit, and I love that job. And one of my main, duties was to deal with books. The Library of Congress gets books from all over the world. Every country sends books. Usually, if I recall, it was two copies. They would send. So I would get these massive buckets and bins full of Arabic books that have not been cataloged, sometimes for years, because there was such a backlog. And I would just peruse through them and so forth. And I eventually came across all these books that were written in Arabic by Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri, none of which had been translated or even paraphrased or quoted from by the media or the scholars of the time. And long story short, I got that turned into a book deal, my first book, which is the Al Qaeda Reader. And the reason I wanted to translate it and the reason the publisher liked my idea was that what I was reading in Arabic completely was the opposite of what Al Qaeda was telling Western media, and Western media was only too happy to relay to the Western public. And that is that Al Qaeda was saying, we attacked you because you attacked us in the Muslim world, whether it's through the manifestation of Israel, whether it's through Iraq, whether it was through whatever. And the laundry list of grievances against Western nations, the U.S. in particular, were endless. But they positioned their hostility as something intelligible from a Western sensibilities, which is to say, they said, you attacked us, we have a grievance, we're attacking you. If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. And that's what the media, the BBC, CNN, even Fox News were spreading, okay, because that's what Al Qaeda wanted them to hear. But what I read was the complete opposite in Arabic, because these now were treatises written directly to fellow Muslims. And long and short of it is, it sounded like ISIS. It was basically, there are enemies because they're infidels, because they don't accept Allah, because the Quran mandates jihad and warfare against them until they're subjugated and given three choices, etc., etc. So that was, to me, that was actually, in a way, eye-opening, because I'm coming from this sort of scholarly historic background where I encountered that in my writings about that first battle, the Battle of Yarmouk. But I too, to a degree, we're talking now, back in 2001, had accepted the mainstream narrative, which is, okay, this has nothing to do with history. This is about grievances, et cetera, et cetera. So it was eye-opening, to say the least, to see the continuity of what Al Qaeda was saying when speaking to fellow Muslims, and infidels weren't being privy to this conversation. So anyway, that was the whole rationale of the Al Qaeda Reader, which I wrote. I started writing it in 2004, I believe, 20 years ago, and it came out finally in 2007. And then after that, basically I started writing articles and so forth. Long story short, I decided to leave the Library of Congress because I was offered fellowships at various think tanks dealing with the Islamic question, elaborating on what I had brought forth from the Al Qaeda Reader. And, that's what I've been doing since. And some of my chief interests have been the Muslim persecution of Christians, which is a completely, unknown topic for various reasons. It's a pandemic in the Islamic world, but they don't talk about it. They just sugarcoat it. They whitewash it. They do anything they can to make it sound like it's not a thing. Okay, even though according to conservative estimates, something like 400 million Christians around the world are being persecuted. And so that was another one of my focuses, which is, of course, to me interesting because that's what my family is. They're Christians from the Middle East. We're Coptic. My background's Coptic Christian, which is the indigenous inhabitants, the original Christians of Egypt. So obviously that struck a chord with me back then. I started writing books, and my next book was The Crucified Again, came out in 2013, exposing Islam's new war against Christians, which chronicled the abuses, modern and past, that Muslims have inflicted upon Christians and gave the Islamic rationale thereof. And I've actually sort of continued that, even though it came out in 2013. Since then, I've been publishing monthly reports that collate all the various instances of Muslim persecution of Christians. So we're talking from it's been I started in 2011, it's 2014. So we're talking 12, 13 years of monthly reports, something like 150 or more reports, each of which are now about 4,000 words and have about a dozen or 2 dozen anecdotes, all of which are just graphic, violent savagery against Christians, and all of which, if it was the opposite, if it was Christians doing it to Muslims, would be all over the mainstream, but none of them ever reach the mainstream. I get these from foreign languages, Arabic primarily, but also small human rights organizations and so forth. So that's also been one of my sort of fortes or interests. And then most recently, I've sort of delved back into my sort of academic background, history, and I've been writing historical books because I've always found the continuity of the conflict very interesting and very unknown. I think a lot of people, including those who like your audience, understand that Islam and the West have been Islam is inherently violent or intolerant or whatever, anti-infidel. I don't think most of them really appreciate the history. Most of them understand it via scriptures, Quranic verses, or the Hadith. Muhammad said this, or the ulama pronounced this consensus, etc. All of which is good and valid, and I myself find interesting and have written about. But I've thought that it seemed to me that there was a lacuna or a vacuum when it came to the actual history, not the early history of Muhammad and the Hadith, but the actual history of all these various, 14 centuries. So after Muhammad, we're talking the Umayyad Caliphate and the Abbasid Caliphate and the Umayyads in Spain who survived, and then the Seljuk Turks, and then, the various groups, the Mamluks in Egypt and the Ottomans in Turk. There seemed to me very few writings to try to show you what was going on there and tracing it to what we know about Islamic doctrine. So if we know Islamic doctrine is anti-infidel, whatever, there weren't many books or writings really showing you how that's the case under these various dynasties and empires. And so I took it upon myself to really delve into that and write about it because that was always my interest historically. From my academic days, well over 20, 25 years ago. And that really manifested itself in 2018 with the publication of my book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and West, which, as its subtitle indicates, was a very comprehensive history of the Christian West and Islam and their battles, and not just the battles, so it really centers around decisive battles, but the bulk of each chapter really deals with the context, which is more important. What was happening before the battles, during the battles, and the aftermath of the battles. So it's really a chronological look into the vast or long war between Islam and Europe, Christendom. And, that was very well received, and there's much we could talk about with what happened, for example, the War College and CARE. We can get into that. But, the book was very successful, and I was asked to write a sort of complimentary book, which I did, and that was the more recent book, Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes who stood against Islam. That came out in 2022, and that book it's really it really complements the first book, Sword and Scimitar. They cover the same terrain, but I'm writing it through the eyes and the experiences of 8 Christian heroes. So they're more like myopic or microcosmic biographies of various Christian defenders, from crusaders to reconquistadors in Spain to Balkanites, including, of course, Vlad the Impaler, the much misunderstood Dracula. And so that's been my second book. And I'm happy to say they've had really a strong impact on people because, like I said, I think there's been a vacuum, a hole in this particular, aspect of history. Whereas a lot of us, we understand the doctrine and we can quote Muhammad and we can quote the Quran and we can say, here's the exegesis and here's what the ulama have an ijma or a consensus on. All of that's great. And I think that in and of itself is potent. But I think there was always a weakness from the historical argument. The academics, the left, if you want to use that word, have really dominated it because it's harder to do history than it is to, collect a few verses and, talk about them. And even though that's an important aspect, like I said. So that's been my mission these days. And the books have been very successful, I'm happy to say. And I'm still writing them. I have another one coming forth and even more, all of them. Because like I said, that field is so fertile, the field of Islam and Christendom, or the field between West and Islam. I got 14 centuries to cull from, it's endless. But the problem is most people can't access this stuff because they go to Barnes and Noble and they grab a book about Islamic history and it's written by Karen Armstrong or John Esposito. And it's nothing but a big whitewash meant to demonize Christians and extol Muslims. Okay. So that's why it's very hard for people to find it, but hence why I've made that basically my mission in recent years. And that's in a nutshell me.
Yeah. And it's funny. You mentioned John Esposito. The first class I took on Islam, that was the required reading. It was John Esposito's books. Karen Armstrong wasn't required reading, but it was strongly recommended for our papers and so on that you learn Karen Armstrong and share that. You mentioned people not knowing their history, and this was shocking to me when I read Robert Spencer's book, The History of Jihad, because I'd been debating Muslims for years and had multiple debates on whether Islam is a religion of peace and Christianity versus Islam and so on. And so I was like kind of what you're talking about. I was familiar with the Quranic passages and the relevant hadith passages and so on. And reading the history of jihad, then all of a sudden it's like 80% of it was stuff I'd never heard before. So, even as someone who deals with this stuff regularly, I would learn basically what happened for Muhammad and the four rightly guided caliphs. That's it. And then giant gap, maybe a little bit of something with the Crusades or the golden age of Islam or something like that. And then Al-Qaeda. That's it. You skip over everything else.
No. And then the colonial era, okay, which is where all the problems begin because these mean Westerners went into the Middle East and Islam and conquered. And that's why Muslims have a grievance. That's usually how it goes. Yeah.
And so it was just shocking to me that again, I'm someone who deals with this stuff regularly, and it was again like 80% new information. I was like, I don't know any of this stuff. And when you see the 14th century history, what really jumped out to me was just how relentless it's been. It's constantly trying to push into Europe, and it's in the East, it's in the West, it's pirates in the Mediterranean and so on. And it was completely relentless. And so that was a big eye opener for me. But I have to say, I'm a little confused now because I've heard of you mentioned over and over again as this Islamophobe who's attacking Islam all these years. And so I think, wow, he's like us. But listening to you, it just sounds like you're just, okay, here's what these guys are saying in Arabic. Let me tell you. Let me just inform you on what they're actually saying. And then, hey, you guys don't know your history. Let me tell you about the history that you don't know about. It kind of sounds like that's all you're doing. And so why would any of that be like Islamophobic?
Well, I'm happy to say that you're right. And if you go on Amazon and you look at these two books, Defenders of the West and Sword and the Scimitar, which get, I think Defenders of the West is at 5 stars and the other one's at 4.5. But if you look at the reviews, a lot of them, surprisingly, and these are the most that I really like, they're from people who identify with the left, who are precisely saying, we Islamophobes and racists and xenophobes, we don't need them. And they say that in their reviews. And they say, that's how we started, but we read this guy's books, and it's like everything is documented, everything is footnoted, everything comes from a primary source. Everything is coming from Muslim sources or contemporaries, Christians. It's kind of hard to discount what this guy is saying as he's just an Islamophobe. He's bringing this, pulling this out of his, arse, as it were. I'm presenting what they said in an objective, neutral fashion. And it just so happens to be overwhelmingly supportive of what you and I say about Islam, for example. And I think that's the shocker, because a lot of people, they think this Islam thing is a new development. Bernard Lewis, even though he's a great historian, he famously said what went wrong, after 2011, implying that things were so, wonderful under Islam. Well, they weren't. If you look at Al-Qaeda, if you look at ISIS, if you look at everything they've done, And we can get into this a little bit, how Islam spread, but it's all, it's all a mirror duplicate of what the Muslim armies did historically. In fact, everything they do, whether it's the beheadings or the enslavement of women, sexual enslavement of Yazidis, Christians, whatever, all of that is them intentionally patterning themselves and trying to emulate their heroes from Islamic history, which is documented in Islamic primary sources. Okay, so this is it's not it's so far different and divorced from what we've been told, which is that ISIS is just this rag band of terrorists, and they've created their own interpretation to validate their evil agenda. No, these guys are like literally reading the scriptures of Islam, reading the history, and trying to pattern themselves. I mean, that's the word sunnah. We hear Sunni Muslims, the majority. That's what the sunnah is, patterning yourself after these early righteous Muslims of Muhammad's era and a little after as well. And they all engaged in what we would call ISIS-type atrocities. So I think the problem in the end for everyone is, and this is the problem with the scriptural argument. When you and I sit, one of my favorite verses I've used is Quran 9:29, which says, fight the people of the book, Christians and Jews, until they pay tribute, jizya, and feel themselves subdued and humbled, etc. Okay, that's great, but the problem is if that is the totality of my argument against or Islam and trying to show the intolerance or violence of it, a lot of people will respond, well, look at the Old Testament, okay, there's genocide in Canaan, et cetera, et cetera. And we can argue that, but the point is the feeling becomes that just because an old book says this doesn't mean its adherents in the modern century are following it. And I think that resonates with a lot of people, whether it's right or wrong. But when you really dig into the history and show, well, guess what? It wasn't just that old book from 14 centuries that said that. It's every single century thereafter, the Muslim caliphates and sultanates and emirates enacted it in keeping up until this very day with ISIS and other Islamic terror groups, as we call them. And they're not really terror groups, they're just Islamic groups. So I think that's the real potency behind and the importance, I think, of making the historical argument and really meticulously documenting, instead of just saying, well, Muhammad said this, or basing your history on the Sunnah and the hagiography of Muhammad, the Sirah, the biography, and saying Muhammad did that. And that's all important. I'm not discounting that. I myself have spent much time writing about that. But, if you do that and you skip, 1200, 14 centuries, a lot of people become leery and just for the arguments that I've given you. And they say, well, yeah, but the Ottoman Empire wasn't like that necessarily because of this, the Seljuks and the Umayyads, and, oh, look at the Golden Age in Spain, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's very important that we do our homework and really meticulously understand the history as well.
And could we say one second? Let me put I had while you were talking, I put the books up on the screen here, and so everyone knows the links to these books on Amazon. The links are in the description box, along with a link to Raymond's website. So be sure to check out the website and grab those books. But could we say that in the environment we're in, where ignorance has been the rule for many, many years, people just don't know. So at first it was people don't even know what the verses in the Quran are. And so you're kind of trying to show people, actually, here's what the Quran says. It calls for the violent subjugation of Jews and Christians and everyone else. And so we point those things out for a while and so on. But there, as you're pointing out, there are lots of assumptions that are underlying everyone. So if you go to your average journalist or your average politician and were to ask him about the history of Islam, chances are he's going to have absolutely no clue about the history of Islam. So as far as the usefulness of learning that history, it seems like it would put people who learn it at a massive advantage in these kinds of discussions about the history of jihad and the history of Islam and things like that, where if you go into a discussion and someone's saying, what are you talking about, man? It's just a modern thing because of Western imperialism, and this caused this backlash of Muslims. That's where it all comes from. If you were actually able to just start recounting battles and dates and things that happened and the aftermath and so on, you'd kind of have a massive advantage in discussions that are meant to deal with this atmosphere of ignorance. So yes, I'm talking to all you out there who are watching. There's lots of, there's a lot of ignorance. And I have to say, if people still keep clinging to really stupid ideas about Islam, I think you're in a lot of trouble. And so if you really want to deal with the problem, then learning and then sharing what you learned would be a really, really good path to go. So guys, be sure to grab those books, learn that material, and then keep in mind there are different levels based on the amount of time people have. Raymond has dedicated his life to this research. You may not have that time. You may have other things that you have to do in your life. Guess what? Learn one thing. I keep telling people that. If you can't learn it all, learn one thing and share that. Learn about one important historical fact and just keep sharing that over and over again. If people don't know about it, you're going to make a difference. Now, Raymond, you did kind of go viral recently on Twitter. I mean, it was a TikTok video. Someone put it on TikTok. I didn't see it on TikTok because I'm not on TikTok, but I know it went viral over on TikTok, so much so that it spilled over into Twitter. I wanted to play that clip here in a second, which is very Islamophobic. But play that clip, and then you kind of that was part of a much longer discussion. So we'll play the clip, and then you can go through the whatever you want from the longer discussion that's relevant for everyone here. But first, let's take this first batch of super chats here. Most people commenting on. Here we say AP on push-ups. Not sure you're familiar with. I normally go live with the apostate prophet, who's an ex-Muslim, agnostic. So that's who they normally see right beside me in the live streams, and so they're saying you're AP but on push-ups. A lot of push-ups.
All right, I'll take that.
Primus here said this dude is jacked. He'd squat Allah and Muhammad at the same time. AP grew his beard back, I see. Yeah, it was caused a lot of people a lot of trauma. AP shaved his beard off recently. Yes, this is the no more people without beards, ladies and gentlemen. And wow, everyone's commenting sort of the same thing. AP got buff. The Nay too.
So wait, I look like some guy named AP. Is that what you're saying?
No, not well. I guess a little in the sense.
You normally have a guy named AP, and they're kind of saying like, "Oh, that's AP," but he's buff,
they're
right?
saying you're like a much more massive, stronger version of AP. Let's see. AP got buff. Here we have Nay says we need Trump back to destroy jihad and vote Trump save USA. I have to say, guys, I wouldn't put much confidence in politicians until you deal with the problem of ignorance, because you could get one politician you like, and guess what? The next election you get a different politician and so on. I don't think you can effectively deal with Islam until you have an informed population of free people. And if you have an informed population of free people, the other pieces will fall into place, because you can vote for people that an informed population of free people would want, and you can get journalists that an informed population of free people would want. Here we have D. Wood and Ray Ibrahim together, finally, like Marvel and DC crossover. Thank you both for your awesome work. God bless you with the best of health for you and your family. Thank you. Ray, please give us a riff on the real Dracula. Actually, I'll pause it there, because I did find that out that, we think of Vlad the Impaler as, again, like the basis for Dracula. And we think, wow, this creepy dude who lives up in his castle and he's impaling people. Whereas people in Eastern Europe still view him as the hero who saved them from repeated Islamic invasions. Why don't you give us the short, since it was requested here, why don't you give us the short version of Vlad the Impaler?
Yeah, happy to do so. And so, for the record, in my last book, Defenders of the West, Vlad is the final chapter. And one of the most, I would say, probably controversial and sensationalist chapters. So the long and short of Vlad is, you're right. In 1897, Bram Stoker, an Irish novelist, wrote a book, Dracula. And like all smart novelists, he tried to give it some sort of historical veneer. So he did a little research about Romania and found this guy, Vlad the Impaler, and read some things about him being violent, impaling, et cetera, et cetera. And so Vlad the Impaler became Dracula, this blood sucking denizen of the night. We know the rest. Anyway, so the real Vlad Impaler, as usual, when you delve into this man's story, first of all, yes, he was. We can, by modern standards, certainly he was sadistic. Okay, and he impaled a lot of people, Muslims and even his own enemies, non-Muslims, most of whom consorted with Muslims against him. Okay, but now here's the missing, backdrop or context. Impalement was pretty normal back then. A lot of people impaled. Number two, he learned impalement from the Ottoman Turks because he was a hostage, him and his brother, in his youth, in the Ottoman court. And him and his brother, I'm sorry, and his younger brother, Raju, the handsome, was turned into a catamite by Muhammad II or Mahmud II, who was a homosexual or bisexual or whatever, some kind of pervert. And, he turned Vlad's younger brother as his boy toy. And Vlad, of course, according to the sources, didn't relent to that kind of lifestyle and was constantly being beaten and whipped and etc. Finally, he escaped, and his brother stayed. And he ran back to modern day Romania, Wallachia, as it was his kingdom. And he was the birthright. He was supposed to be the voivode or warlord or king of Wallachia, and he became it eventually. And then he just ruled with an iron hand because everything was in chaos. And he implemented the Turks' own, he fought fire with fire. So the Turks, whom he learned impalement under, once they attacked him and vastly outnumbered him, of course, because the Ottoman Empire was a behemoth against small nations like Wallachia, which was just full of cowpokes and peasants who didn't even have proper arms. And so even in all their wars, the Wallachians were constantly outnumbered by something like 1 to 15. And the Ottomans, like I said, were a professional army, armed with all the sophisticated weaponry, where like the other guys were walking around with just shovels and pokes and whatever farm tools they could use. So in order to fight them back and rebuff them, he engaged in the terror tactics that they were, and he would just completely impale any Turk that he could find, and he created what's called the forest of the impaled surrounding his castle, and it really terrified the Turks. And in one memorable incident, the Turks sent emissaries to threaten him, to say, "We expect you to give us your young men to become janissaries, slave soldiers for the Ottomans." And the first thing he said to the Ottoman emissaries, because they were of course wearing turbans, is, you're under my roof, and I'm royalty. You need to remove your turbans. And they said, it's our custom and our religion says we can't. So he said, okay, to help enforce your custom, I'll make sure you can never remove them. And he had their turbans nailed onto their heads and then sent them back in ignominy to Muhammad II, saying, we don't want your customs, we don't want your threats. This is, take your stuff and go back to your own realm. And of course, war and jihad was declared on him. And you can read the rest in the book. It's very long. He had many heroic adventures, and he fought back. And he actually, you can say he won until he was betrayed, including by his now, sodomite homosexual brother, who became the complete creature of Muhammad II and others. And the long story short, and then he got killed, of course, etc. I don't want to give too much of the story because it's very, so many movies could be made about the actual Vlad the Impaler vis-a-vis Islam, but of course, all we get is the Bram Stoker version of this undead bloodsucker, which has nothing to do with history. But that's really the real kind of tragic story. He's something of a tragic hero. And like you said, until this very day, Romanians, he ranks, whenever there's a poll amongst Romanians, he's like often in the top 10 most loved and revered figures of Romanian history. And there's a reason for it. because no matter, he may have been draconian or extreme, but it was really needed in the context of the times as a weak Christian force fighting this monstrous behemoth of Islam. And he could only fight the only way he could, which included, of course, the terror tactics.
Do I recall correctly that there was at some point the Ottomans were invading and the armies marching, and as they're going along the road, there's just mile after mile after mile of
Yeah.
impaled Ottoman soldiers, and at some point they just said, "Screw this," and turned around and
Yeah.
left. Huh.
Yep, that's part of the original story. It was just, and it was calculated terrorism. Terrorism works when you're fighting a stronger foe. Obviously, we can judge it ethically if we want, but in the context of the times, you had a small innocent a group of people who want to maintain their culture and their religion without being killed, and you had a pretty ruthless warlord, Vlad the Impaler, who did whatever he could to ensure that, and included just terrorizing the hell out of the Ottomans. And mind you, they're the ones who were pretty sadistic and terrifying everyone else. So it was kind of a table turn for him to do this to them so effectively,
And yeah,
which
rough.
earned him, of course, because he had the nerve to fight back the Ottomans. Fire with fire. Now he's the evil
Yeah,
bloodsucker
shame on you.
monster. Yeah, exactly.
Shame on you for keeping Europe
Yeah,
from being
yeah.
invaded.
The nerve. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
shame on that guy. SNR says, I wanted to make a silly comment, but Raymond made me want to do something manly. I'm going to go eat a scoop of protein powder straight. God bless.
Go eat a raw steak. No, I'm just kidding.
AP, cool down with the whey. You're already jacked. Let's see. I notice Muslims claim they are Abrahamic, but Genesis 22:2, 12:16 shows God only claims Isaac. God doesn't claim Ishmael anywhere. Am I wrong? Well, God says he would make Ishmael a great nation, but that was actually fulfilled in the time of Genesis. As far as the son of promise, so the one through whom God's promises to Abraham that his offspring would be a blessing to all the world. Yeah, that's traced through Isaac and Jacob. Um, let's see. Once, I don't know if you don't have to answer this. Want to know Ray's fitness regime? They're actually,
Here's the thing. I've been working out forever. Before I became something of a brainiac in my early 20s, I was actually a competitive bodybuilder. And it goes back to, I used to be a football player, and then I injured myself. I was supposed to play college football as a defensive end or a linebacker, and I just loved weightlifting. So I had busted knees and elbows, but I stayed with weightlifting, and I engaged in bodybuilding. And this is all early 20s. So by 22, I was done. But I still played around with it, and but from 30s to 45s, I was so busy. But now I'm kind of relaxing and I have a little leisure time. So I find myself gravitating back towards the gym to sort of, exercise my aggression and, frustration at everything. And, so that's, I guess, what you're seeing.
yeah, it's funny. I saw a Dave Chappelle interview, and he was saying because he used to be this little skinny guy, and then he come up and he was all big all of a sudden, and he says he would just be ticked off about stuff, and he decided to not channel it into drugs or something like this. So he said I would just go to the gym, and I just kept getting bigger and bigger
Exactly.
and bigger for
Yep.
all the stuff that was ticking me off, and I just run to the gym and start lifting, and so yeah, kind of works, guys. So guys,
It does.
channel your rage in a positive direction, everyone. You heard it here. What are the best sources for learning Islamic view of marriage? Reading Al-Ghazali, lovely Sunnah like a straw man is better than a barren woman, black mother better than a childless beauty. Yeah, it kind of depends on what you're looking for. If you want the original, if you want what the Quran and the Hadith say, you can just look up those passages. I mean, there are sections in the Hadith that will talk about marriage, and there'll just be entire sections on marriage and so on. If you want what later Muslim scholars said and concluded, then you can go there. Apostate from Allah says Coptic AP is based. So they're calling
Thank
him
you.
Coptic. He's his own person, ladies and gentlemen. He was around
Who's this
before.
AP guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll have to fill me in on this AP later.
Right. So let's go ahead and jump into this vid. Let me read one more. I am really, really impressed by everything both of you are saying. I felt everything because I grew up in Bosnia, an Islamic entity working on eliminating Christians, and they are almost succeeding. I don't know much about the situation there. All right. Now let's go ahead and we're going to check out this clip that went viral on TikTok, and then you can give us the background here. Let me see. Where did I put this? All right. I'm going to check this out.
You're not doomed yet, but...
So the question was not included. Did someone just stand up during the Q&A and say, are we doomed?
Yeah, someone, and by the way, let me just explain something. You're going to see me like chewing and smacking my lips and, some unseemly sort of behavior. And that's because I had given the talk, which was about an hour, and then we had a break, and this was in Denmark, and they served me all this Danish chocolate and beer, which I ravenously attacked. And then like in 1 second, they were like, all right, we have a question for you while I'm still eating. And the question was, I believe, something like, so are we doomed? Is there any hope?
Mm-hmm. It's always good to give all the beer beforehand because that makes things fun. Makes things fun. Right. All right. So here you are asked after they shoved a bunch of chocolate in your face and gave you some beer. Then you're asked, are we doomed? And here's your response.
Right. You're not doomed yet, but and in all of world history, there has never been a civilization that has so opened its doors to another civilization that is openly hostile to it. So this is unprecedented, what's happening. Your ancestors of Europe, and I describe it in my books because I write about history, fought tooth and nail to prevent Islam from entering and conquering Europe. Because that was one of the grand plans that went on for century after century from the east. The Turks were trying to enter Constantinople. They surrounded Vienna in 1683. And before that, the Muslims, I told you, went up into Tours in France in 732, 1,000 years later. This was an actual goal. And now Western Europe is saying, oh, none of that matters. It was a misunderstanding. Come on in. But they haven't changed. That mentality, and when I say they, that's obviously, I'm simplifying. The mentality that I've described is part of Islam. It's an Islamic concept. So the Islamic State, you're told, oh yeah, they have nothing to do with Islam. They've twisted it. No, they haven't. They are a representation of what Islam, the caliphs, the sultanates, the emirates, that's how they operated. The heads of Islam, the grand imams and the muftis said the same exact thing. Okay, so that is what it is. Again, it's not my point to arguing, oh, well, this particular migrant wants to conquer you. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's looking for a good life. I understand that, and that's what makes it complicated. But to just open your borders completely to that demographic, which has within it, not all of it, but within it, that kernel of animosity for Christians and so-called infidels and the imperative to conquer the world in the name of jihad for Allah, which... They're the good guys, keep in mind. They never see themselves as the bad guys. This is one of the issues with all conflicts. They're not bad guys. They're good guys in their minds. You're the bad guys because you're infidels, and they're trying to bring the light of Islam to you. So that's another aspect of how moral, or the morality that they feel. They're the good guys, okay, in doing this. Because look at you, Denmark and Europe, you're all dissipated drunks and, profligates and... there's no real. I'm sharing with you their arguments because I read it and I hear it. So they're bringing to you goodness, okay? But before your ancestors, because I guess they had their own social order and their own goodness, and it was called Christianity, were able to fight it. But I guess in this current void of sort of this atheistic climate, anything goes, and who's to say they're wrong? Maybe they're right, etc., etc. And now you have what's happening. So it's a very unprecedented experience. A lot of people talk about the Roman Empire, this sort of thing happened, but it didn't, and we can get into that. It was actually, they were still cognizant of trying to maintain their own social, cultural mores, Rome. And it fell to the Goths and the Germanic peoples. And I'm just saying, some people use this analogy, But in this case, this is completely your doing. Not you, but it's Europe's doing. Okay, you're bringing a hostile force that's openly hostile. And lo and behold, when I look where Muslims are, I see chaos and violence and criminality and rape and grooming in England. Okay, that's what always happened under Islam. Okay, so is there a hope? I think so. I hope so in time. But it's so bad that it even had to get to this point. You know, it's such an abnegation and betrayal of your own heritage, of these men and women who fought and died to preserve your way of life against an open, hostile force, and now they're being welcomed in, and why not? It's okay. So I guess so. It's a matter of time.
So where's the hope? Excuse me. So where's the hope? You say there is
the hope is to wake up, wake up and see what reality and what I'm talking about, and understand the history and the doctrine of Islam and what Islam is all about. Islam is unequivocally hostile.
You're making a point that I keep making over and over again in streams and videos, and you even see some atheists getting the point. Richard Dawkins, actually, to his credit, saw it kind of before a lot of his followers did. I think it was back in 2011 or something like that. He said in an interview, he said, he was asked about the decline of Christianity in Europe. And he said, I have mixed feelings about the decline of Christianity in Europe because I think it may have been a bulwark against something worse. Mm-hmm. And it's a point I've been making that, atheists of the world, say whatever you want about Christians, but for 14 centuries, Christians in Europe had the common sense to say, hey, whatever else we disagree about here, whatever else we argue about, whatever else we fight about, we all agree, right, that we are not going to be controlled by that. Are we in agreement? East, West, do we all understand this, that we are not going to be controlled by that? And like the moment you had Christians going secular, or you had millions of people becoming atheists and so on, like the moment it happens, we can't invite Islam into Europe fast enough. We just can't get enough of this Islam. It's the greatest thing ever. Please, please, please let us have more Islam. Very, very weird stuff. Anyway, just wanted to get to it. There's a question here that ties in, and then I'm going to hand it over to you to share any information backing up what you're saying there, or talking about Christians of the past, or the history of jihad. Anything you want to discuss. We have some rude joking here, saying, "Is this Diha al-Kalbi?" It's actually a compliment. He was a companion of Muhammad, who was known as the handsomest guy in town. He would show up to town, and the ladies were said to walk out to check him out.
Oh, maybe, yeah, maybe.
Here was the question that I wanted to bring up for you. Don't know how familiar you are. I'm sure you're probably somewhat familiar with Memory TV, but they say, is Memory TV translations accurate? So are these translations trustworthy, as far as you know?
I've watched some of their translations, and I understand Arabic, so I can compare, and by and large, they are accurate. I've seen other issues, not necessarily dealing with accuracy of translations, but of dates, presenting certain things as happening on this date, but they actually happened at a different date. But by and large, from what I've seen with the translations, they seem accurate.
All right. And we have the Countess here saying, Vlad and I are often mistaken for evil vampires. Yep, true. Raymond Ibrahim does actually have a similar. They're actually saying you do look like AP, except you're.
Who the hell's AP? Who's this AP?
That's what I say. Who is this AP? Guys,
you got to send me a picture.
Yeah, AP's old news, ladies and gentlemen. We got the upgrade here. We got the upgrade, and Son of the Dragon certainly was a true hero. Is that what they called him?
Yeah, Dracul was his father, which means a dragon, and Dracula with a little a means son of the dragon.
All right. So we have that clip, ladies and gentlemen. And you guys, you can find that if you just type in Raymond Ibrahim on Twitter, you can find that clip. So it's definitely a good clip to share. But we have the man himself here. So what What would you like to share with everyone that led you to make those claims about Islam and Christendom?
Well, let's. I think it'd be a good opportunity right now for me to run through 14 centuries of jihad in maybe 5-10 minutes. And I think much of what I'm going to say is the sort of thing that people are not aware of, because I think most learned Islamophobes like you and me and your audience, most of them are aware of Muhammad, the Hadith, the early, Islam, and then ISIS. Okay, so I'm going to give you the filler, the other 13 centuries, and the reason is to show you how well they conform to what Muhammad did and said, as well as ISIS. Okay, and within that, I think I'll give you a little bit of information that may mind boggle some people because they just don't know it. Because here's the problem, and I'm going to digress a little bit, but I think this is important. If you really if you want to learn about Islamic history vis-a-vis the West, let's say, what are you going to do? If you're an average guy, okay, you're going to go to the bookstore, you're going to go in the Islam history or whatever, Middle East history, and you're going to find a book. And you're going to find Karen Armstrong, you're going to find John Esposito, and a lot of other fools. And you're going to buy it and you're going to read it, because you're not about to go and do some, find some primary, chronicle written in Latin or Greek or Arabic and try to translate it, obviously. And then you read that, and it's going to tell you essentially the exact opposite of what happened. Okay, and I'll get into that. I know that sounds hyperbolic on my part, but it's literally oftentimes the antithesis of what happened. It's a complete lie, fabrication. Okay, but to the innocent bystander who read this secondary history, you can't blame him, because he went to Barnes and Noble, he got a book, and then the worst part is, he reads this and he believes it, and now he thinks he knows. So, the guy who never read anything, the layman, he's actually better, because he's willing to admit, I don't know. Okay, Muslims are violent. I get it. Makes sense. Oh, they're not. Okay, they're moderate. Okay, I get it. But the guy who reads indoctrination, what happens is he thinks now, I'm learned. I know more than the other guy. But in fact, what he learned is just lies, and he tenaciously clings to them. Okay.
Hey, well, I just wanted to insert one thought there, because the guy you're describing is still someone who actually might go to a bookstore and get a book. We've actually got worse scenarios right now where someone someone watches a YouTube video.
Right.
By,
you're right.
Of a
you're
talk,
right.
or even worse, someone reads a tweet and now they consider themselves experts and so on. So you're sitting here talking about this dummy who goes to the bookstore and thinks, I got this book by Karen Armstrong, I'm an expert. I'm like,
who's really a genius.
Yeah, I'm like, this guy's like epic researcher by other standards. Yeah, sorry about that, but
no, that's well taken. You're right. Okay, so but my point is, it's almost better to be ignorant and just be like your layman who knows nothing, but he has his gut feeling, and he can understand something, than to be the guy who actually did research. Because if you're that guy, chances are you read propaganda, which was intentionally written. We've known about fake news for a little bit now, but fake history is much older and even more potent, in my opinion, because fake history sets the stage for you to be able to say fake news, okay? Because it's the first premise, all right? So my point, ultimately, all I'm trying to say is that it's funny because the guys who read and study and whatever are much worse because A, they're fed lies, and B, they think to themselves, hey, I'm not the guy who just watches videos and TikToks. I read a whole book. I know, all right? But they know nothing. They know absolute lies. You know nothing, Jon Snow, essentially, okay? So that's the whole point. Now, let me tell you what really happened with the history. Quick blitz, assuming I got 5-10 minutes. All right. So in the 7th century, Islam is born, right? Muhammad, 570 born, died 632, according to the traditional, historiography. And 2 years after his death, jihad is declared. And Muhammad himself declared and actually negotiated with the Eastern Roman Emperor, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, and basically told him, convert to Islam or else. And Heraclius rejected it. Muhammad died soon thereafter, and then jihad erupted out of Arabia. Okay. Now, I think the really important point that most people miss is a lot of people understand the Arab conquest, the Islamic conquest that I'm discussing, but they don't understand how fundamentally and profoundly Christian that region was. Today when you think of Christianity historically, pre-modern era, you think of medieval Europe, which of course was Christian. But if you go back at the dawn of Islam and you look at Christendom in its entirety, which was Europe, at least southwest of um, uh, the Danube River, basically with Germany, um, you're going to see that the bulk of it, the more sophisticated, the more intelligent, the richer, the more accultured, was the East. It was North Africa. And again, this is so like counterintuitive to the modern mind. North Africa, really? And it was the Middle East. It was Egypt and Syria and what we call Turkey, Asia Minor. Okay, so in the 7th century, you want to talk about Christianity, it was those regions. Europe was Christian, Rome and so forth, and even Britain, Spain, Italy, France. They were Christian, but they were like the little brother, okay? Whereas everything, and this is why the Roman Emperor, Constantine, moved the capital to the east, because that's where it's at, okay? All the early church fathers, all the theological controversies, articulations, the heretics, they're all from the east. Egypt, it's surprising. You think of Egypt, you hear Egypt, you think it's a Muslim country. Egypt is where Egypt is where you have the oldest picture of Christ. You have the oldest Christian manuscript. John Cassian in the 5th century traveled. He's a European monk, up and down, and all he heard is monasteries and monks praying. Okay, that's how fundamentally Christian it was. Athanasius, the Nicene Creed, which Christian denominations, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestants still profess, articulated it. The first major heretic, Arius, also an Egyptian. Okay, Saint Augustine, the father of Western theology, North African, from basically Algeria or Tunisia, Hippo. We forget that like Christianity, it wasn't just the cradle where it was born. That's where it really was. That's where the early church fathers, the early articulation of Christian theology, the catechetical schools in Alexandria. Okay, you had 5 C's or centers. Only one was in the West, Rome. The other 4 were in the East. And the oldest ones were Alexandria and Antioch and Jerusalem, and later Constantinople. Okay, which again is why Constantine moved over there, and that's why it became named Constantinople. It was called Byzantium earlier. So again, I'm just trying to explain the backdrop of what happened, because it's too often, there's this idea that Islam just spread and that whole area was like either a Muslim or ready to be Muslim. No, that was the Christian world right there. And so if you look at the sources now, Islam erupts out of Arabia. The first battle that I told you I wrote a master's thesis about, Yarmouk 636 in Syria. They win, they defeat the Eastern Roman Empire. And then 2 years later, they conquer Egypt. And then, they march on westward all the way until they conquer modern-day Tunisia, Maghreb, and then they enter Spain in the year 711. Okay, and they conquer Greater Syria, which encompasses all the modern states we have today: Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, and all of this is now conquered. And if you look at the map, and historians have called it, Islam conquered 3/4 of the Christian world. Okay, the three most important quarters of the Christian world. Who ever heard of that? You read a history book. Have you ever heard that Islam violently annexed and conquered 3/4, 75% of what was then Christendom? No one ever hears that. But that's exactly what happened. And it was even worse, because then they entered Europe. Spain was completely subjugated, except for a small pocket of Christian resistance in the northwest of the peninsula. And then 100 years after Muhammad died in 632, in 732, now they're in the middle of France, doing what ISIS does: killing, ransacking, raping, enslaving, burning churches. Until finally the Franks, Charles Martel and so forth, at the famous Battle of Tours, defeat them. And even then, it's not like they just disappeared. They were holed up in Spain, where they continued the atrocities. And then the Mediterranean, which was, of course, all Christian, was awash with jihadist raids and conquests, all of them highlighting ISIS depravity and atrocities, okay, which we never hear about. And so then, now we come to the Dark Ages, or what, historians shy away from the term Dark Ages nowadays, but it was pretty popular. And for the longest time, historians said the Dark Ages, were a product of the Germanic, the Germanic peoples overrunning Rome in the 5th century, 476, sacking Rome, and then essentially planting themselves all over the old Roman Empire, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Francia or Gaul, and so forth. But, if you look at smarter historians such as Henry Perrin, who came up with his own thesis in the 19th century, he traced it directly to the Islamic conquest, because the Islamic conquest completely severed the Roman lake, which was known as the Mediterranean, which is what kept Christendom combined. And even before Christendom, Rome, the Roman Empire, it was, of course, those southern European nations, Spain, Italy, and so forth, as well as Egypt and Syria. That was it. Egypt was the grain basket that fed the Roman Empire. So with the conquest, you had a complete severing, and now the older or the younger and weaker Christian world, with Rome as the center, was cut off and left there without any more continuity with the East, which is what gave it succor for centuries. And therein is really the origins of the Dark Ages. And this is where literacy is lost, because they can no longer get papyrus from Egypt, for example. This is where everyone runs to the highlands because they can't be on the coast, where Islamic raids were habitual and people were being abducted and killed and kidnapped and sold in Barbary and so forth. So these are the forgotten, episodes of history that really led to the development of the West. In fact, the word the West, if you look at it, it itself is a reflection of Islamic conquests, because the original Christian entity, the Christian world, Christendom, was not Europe as we think. It was Europe, but also all of North Africa and the Middle East. Okay. And 3/4 of that was completely swallowed up. So what was left? The Western appendage of Europe, the West. Okay. This is why it's the West versus the East. Okay. And people, of course, don't make that connection of why till this day, this civilization is called the West, because it was the westernmost portion of Christendom that didn't get conquered, even though it was continuously harried and attacked. Okay, now I've only reached about the 9th century. I started it in the 7th. Okay, but after that, now you have the Seljuk manifestation, the Turks. The Turks overrun the Middle East. They become Sunni Muslims, and they take to jihad more than anyone else, more than the Arabs that preceded them. And the reason for that is because Islam, when we come down to it, is all the genius of Islam. It was formulated by a Bedouin and formulated for tribesmen, and therefore it's a tribal religion. So if you're a tribesman, if you're a Turkic tribesman or a Mongol or a Berber or an Arab, it makes perfect sense. It's black and white. It's us versus them. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. That is tribalism. But Islam deified it. So it's no longer just, inherent human tribalism. Now, God wants this. God, Allah, is ordering tribalism. He wants you to fight, kill, destroy, subjugate all of those who are the other tribe. The Ummah, we hear the Ummah, which is the Islamic world, the Islamic nation. That's all it is. It's the super tribe, the super Islamic tribe, and everyone is its enemy. Everyone that's not part of the tribe is the enemy. And that mentality existed and impelled Muslims for centuries against everyone. Okay, so now the Seljuks, they absorb this, and according to historians, this isn't my words, and I quote this in my books. A lot of historians will tell you they took to jihad more than the Arabs did, because again, it fit perfectly with their own tribal ethos. And then now it's now it's the 10th century, 11th century, and now you got the Turks running amok in Asia Minor, which is one of the oldest Christian regions. This is where St. Paul sent so many of his epistles. Okay, and now if you read the sources, contemporary sources, hundreds of thousands of Christians, mostly Armenians. We think of the genocide of the Armenians at the hands of Turks as a 20th or 19th century manifestation. That's the tail end of it. It really began over 1,000 years ago in the 11th century. And you can read about the depravities. I have them in my book, where Armenia is completely devastated. Christian, one of the cities, Ani, had 1,001 churches. all of them burned to the ground. Tens or hundreds of thousands of women and children forcibly enslaved, taken into the Islamic domains. Christians butchered, crucified, beheaded constantly. Now, this is in the late 11th centuries. It's after the Battle of Manzikert. So we're talking 1080, 1090. And that's the origin of the Crusades. So now we finally come to the much ballyhooed and condemned Crusades, which are always presented in a vacuum. If you talk to any the people I was discussing who don't know anything, but they read books, they'll tell you the problem begins with the Crusades. You know, John Esposito, I have a quote from him somewhere, and I'm paraphrasing it, though it's near verbatim. He says something like, 4 centuries of peace elapsed between the Islamic world and Christendom until an evil papal power play and an imperialistic endeavor pushed all these Christians to the Holy Land, and they ruined it all, creating mistrust and grievances in the Muslim world. Okay. No, what actually happened is it was 4 centuries of continuous conquest of Christian lands, 3/4 of which were absorbed. And finally, in 1095, Christendom, Europe, was strong enough to actually marshal a counteroffensive, which is the First Crusade. And anyone who bothers to read the primary sources of what they said, what the Christians of the time, Pope Urban II, Peter the Hermit, Alexios the Emperor, it was all about what those Turks and Muslims were doing to Christians in the Holy Land and in Asia Minor, which was, and I have all the sources in my books. It's really it's pornographic, it's depraved, what they were doing to boys, to women and their mothers. Okay, and this is what propelled the First Crusade. But we're not told any of that. All we're told, like I said, is that everything was fine, and then these evil Catholic Christians decided to go and ruin it. Okay, and that's why until today, the Crusades are, like I said, very demonized. People like Obama will mention them, and other politicians, as, you know, the litmus test to Christian depravity and so forth. But for those who take the time to actually read what happened, and again, I'm very sorry that so many secondary modern day historians, including good ones like Runciman, Steve Runciman, Sir Stephen Runciman, who wrote one of the best, literary histories of the Crusades, they fall for the same thing. And I'll give you a perfect example. I've compared this. Every modern day historical book about the Crusades will talk about the conquest of Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099. I think in July 15 or so, when the Crusaders finally sacked Jerusalem, which was their endeavor to relieve and release the Holy Land from Muslim occupation and violence. And all of them wax and wane about the depravities and the atrocities the Christians committed. Okay, I mean, you can read 3, 4, 5 pages about it. But when it comes to the 100-time worse attacks by Muslims, which are countless, on Crusaders and others, those don't get no mention at all whatsoever. They don't even exist. And so it's this idea, you try to, history is being manipulated by, you suppress all the negative facts about Islam, and then you find the one little thing that you can just blow out of proportion about the Christians. Okay, and that's what the modern day historiography of the Crusades has largely been. There's been some exceptions by some notable scholars, and kudos to them. But by and large, that if you go to college and you study the Crusades, that's what you're going to be fed with. And so it's a very, I say this and I really spend time on this because, the Crusades in the totality of the war between Christians and Muslims was really a drop in the bucket. But that's all Western people know. Okay, they don't know about the first 4 centuries that I mentioned, the Battle of Yarmouk and the conquest of 3/4 of Christendom. Certainly don't know about what happens after the Crusades, especially the Ottomans and their conquest of Europe, reaching as far as Vienna and the atrocities, or how Muslims reached, they were going to Iceland to gather slaves, also under the jihadist imperative. They were gathering slaves from England. They actually occupied an island, Lundy, off of the west coast of Britain, which was their base to get slaves to take and sell in North Africa. They invaded and were ransacking Denmark. People aren't aware of this. Or the fact that America's very first war as a nation was with Muslims who were thinking and acting like ISIS. And I'm talking about the Barbary Wars, okay, which begin in the late 1700s, or at least hostilities begin. And what were they? North African Muslims started ransacking and invading American vessel ships in the Atlantic and taking all their sailors, torturing them, parading them as slaves in the souk or the bazaar in North Africa, and all the rest, the ISIS stuff, the torture, the mockery, etc. And it's with Thomas Jefferson. It just shows you how these enlightened folk like Thomas Jefferson were so clueless. They kind of remind me of today's left. But he finally met with the ambassador of Barbary, he and John Adams, and they said, who are you? Why are you doing this to us? We want to be your friend. We respect all people, all religions." And the ambassador said, "It's according to our Quran and our prophet. You're the infidel. You're the enemy. We have to lay in wait to plunder you and ambush you and kill you, etc." He was paraphrasing Quran 9:5, basically. Not that Jefferson could understand that, even though he owned a Quran. Okay, so it just shows you the continuity is so unwavering, and it has been nonstop. But we've, in keeping with the fake news of today, we've had fake academics who, in order to validate their own narratives of evil Christians, poor Muslims, have completely ignored all of the violence, and which is, like I said, that is the bulk of it. And then they focused on that little drop in the bucket called the Crusades, because now they have an excuse. Oh, we have Europeans traveling to Muslim lands, therefore they're the aggressors, without understanding, of course, that those Muslim lands were conquered by Muslims. Jerusalem was Christian for centuries before the Muslims conquered it in 637 AD, or I'm sorry, 638 or 9 AD, soon after the Battle of Yarmouk. Okay, so that's okay, but for Christians to want to get it back, well, they're horrible monsters. So this is why I really emphasize that we really need to understand the history, because it gives you a deeper understanding, and it really demonstrates the continuity of what we're talking about. It's not just the Quran says this and Muhammad said this, and now we have a lacuna of 14 centuries, and now we have ISIS saying the same thing. This has been problematic for other people who are possibly open-minded, and for the same reasons that I told you, which is they'll say, okay, well, the Old Testament's full of violence. Does that mean, what does that prove? I know that, modern day Jews don't believe in stoning homosexuals, as like Leviticus says. So why should I believe that the Quran says this, therefore all Muslims? So I think it's really imperative to show you that, well, the reason you should believe it isn't just because it's in the Quran, but because century after century, different iteration and manifestation of Islamic groups, from those who were Arabs, from those who were Turks, from those who were Berbers, from those who were Mongols, the Tatars. Let's not forget, 200 years, Russia was under the Tatar yoke, which is often, again, in the secular rendering, presented as Mongols subjugating Russians. But guess what? They were Muslim, and they did all the same sort of Sharia required subjugation. They destroyed churches. They made them pay jizya. They did all the same sort of ideological animosity towards Christians, and most people don't know that. Okay, so it's everywhere you look, but the historians have hidden it, and and that's been a potent weapon in their arsenal. We can argue the doctrine, we can argue the Quran, we can argue what Muhammad said, but they'll argue, well, yeah, but 14 centuries or say otherwise. There's the golden era in Spain, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, what's happening today, ISIS, et cetera, they're an aberration, obviously. It's a compelling argument unless you know the history.
You're talking, very good, by the way. You're talking about this, when people have this basically 12 or 13 century gap where they don't know anything that happened except for a few random things they've heard of, like the Crusades or something like that. When people don't know, when there's just atmosphere of ignorance, it allows a person to come in and say whatever they want, and people aren't going to know any better. So when they see that YouTube video, or when they hear something that John Esposito said or something like that, or Karen Armstrong, they don't know any better. They don't know any better. Yeah. So it makes them sort of an open canvas to write any sort of nonsense that other people want. And you think what could be done to change this? But I mean, it's a really deep problem. Because if you're going to a university and you decide to become an expert in this field or something like, there's going to be, most places, there's going to be relentless pressure on you the entire time you're doing your studies to conform to that overall picture of Islam was wonderful and peaceful, and then a bunch of European Christians came down and started attacking them, and that's led to all the problems. Your professors are gonna keep pushing you in that direction because they were pushed in that direction, and then this becomes the next generation of professors, and they're all saying the same story, and people don't realize how terrible this is for Western civilization when you have an entire culture that has absorbed the idea that this group only hates us because of all the mean things we did to them, unprovoked. We did all these mean things to them. Well, how are you going to complain about them now? We can't complain about them now if they're, grooming little girls and gang raping them. And so we kind of deserve it. We deserve it because in order to atone for our sins of the past, we just have to look the other way as they're destroying the civilization, and more power to them in destroying our evil civilization for all the evil it's done. We need to be completely replaced. Whereas, I mean, if you actually were to absorb the real story, where Islam has always been relentlessly coming for Christians, and it took a ton of their lands, and now it has it's had its eyes on Europe for a long time, just because that wasn't the place where they could really seal the deal. That Islam was always coming for that stuff. Eventually the caliphate collapses because they lose World War I, and the caliphate collapses, and all of a sudden, now we get to rewrite all of history, and Muslims are the victims, and if you absorb that idea, wow. But if you had the correct idea and people actually shared the correct idea, no, for 13 centuries they came for us until they, and the only times they ever stopped was when they lost in battle. That's when they would stop for a while to make preparations for the future until they would try again. And then they lose the caliphate, and you'd think, oh, okay, we're fine then, when they can't compete militarily anymore. And so they're finding another way, and their way into Europe now is just finding ignorant people who will believe almost anything because they don't know anything, and give them a sob story about how we've always been the victims and you've always been the oppressors, and people buy it. Then they don't want to stand against what centuries of Christians actually stood against. Where going with what you're saying, it's no, these were Christian lands. They were the oppressors. These guys came in and they were the oppressors, and they forcibly converted people, and they subjugated people, and they were raping and killing and torturing and so on. And they were going to do it here until they were going to do it in Europe until they got stopped. And now you're saying, let them continue that. Let them continue what they were doing for centuries until they were stopped. And what's actually going on now is people saying, let them start that up. That's been their goal all along. This isn't some new thing where they're just trying to get back because you have pressed them. It's always been the goal to take over Europe. And this is so guys, when we're talking about, learning the history, checking out the books and so on. Again, if you tuned in late, there's a link to 2 books by Raymond Ibrahim that are very relevant to this discussion. The point of learning it is not just to know this information. You need enough people to know this that they can refute a very seriously ingrained bad idea and false idea that has just permeated everyone. Like politicians, journalists, educators, entertainers, they've all absorbed a completely false picture of the history of interactions between the Muslim world and the Christian world. And that idea is so bad and so dangerous that it's going to destroy your society if you don't actually learn to correct it. So, I don't know. Dangerous stuff. Point here is, ladies and gentlemen, whatever else you're doing, it seems like it should be a priority. It seems like it should probably be a priority, learning to correct the nonsense.
Let me add a couple of things there, David, which really complement what we're saying here. I want to read you first a quote from historian. He's an Anglo-French, half English, half French historian, Hilaire Belloc. Okay, who was born in 1870. And what makes his writings interesting, he died, I think, in 18, maybe, I'm sorry, 1950 or so, is this man lived in the peak of Western dominance over Islam. This is the colonial era. Okay, Islam, by 1800, 1850, after the Barbary Wars, it's over. And now Europe, has a meteoric rise, military, economic, etc. And they flood into the Islamic world, and that's where they colonize, as well as India and so forth. Okay, and when he's writing, he wrote this maybe around 1930. Islam is gone. It's a spent force. If anything, Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, who were the scourge of Europe, had completely betrayed their identity just to conform to the Western European paradigm. They got rid of the Arabic script. They got secular. They adopted the Roman alphabet. They shaved their beards and turbans, etc. So he's writing in that context where, to the Western world, they forgot all about Islam, and it's a meaningless moot point. Okay, here's what he writes, quote, and I'm reading it, it's in my book, Sword and Scimitar. He writes, millions of modern people of the white civilization, that is the civilization of Europe and America, have forgotten all about Islam. They have never come in contact with it. They take for granted that it is decaying and that, anyway, it is just a foreign religion which will not concern them. It is, as a fact, the most formidable and persistent enemy which our civilization has had and may at any moment become as large a menace in the future as it has been in the past. I mean, you talk about prophetic words. He wrote this at the nadir of Islamic power about a century ago. And look where we're at. I mean, Muslims are still weak, and this is the irony, but, Westerners are such idiots that they empower them over them. And here we're seeing this sort of second recrudescence of Islam going on. And another point I just wanted to make, to really underscore how history has been manipulated. There's a book written by another associate of Georgetown University, which was presented to me right when my book, this book, Sword and Scimitar, the title is 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and West. I tell you that because that book was called Jihad and Crusade, and I think the subtitle is like The 1,000 Years of War. And it was brought to my attention by my agent, a literary agent, saying, this might be a competitor book, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, the book came out. It's like 800 pages long. And just to give you an idea, it's meant to do the same thing that my book does. I go from the first, violence in the 7th century between Islam and the West to the modern era. And that's what it purports to do. In 700 or 600 pages, here's what happens. The first, from the 7th century, the rise of Islam, until about 1800, over 1,000 years, gets 20 pages. Okay? This is the bulk of my book. This is the time when Islam is conquering, pulverizing, and destroying Christendom. Okay? It gets 20 hygienic pages, and a lot of obfuscation and ambiguity and circular logic. You don't even ever understand that Islam was really conquering the West. Okay, and then the other 500 pages start with the colonial era. Okay, so now look at the big bad Europeans. They're in Africa, they're in the Middle East, they're in Asia, and that's why Muslims are angry, and this is why they're retaliating today. Okay, so these are the sorts of games that these academics play, and these are the sorts of books which are promoted and that people who want to learn access and read, and then they leave with a completely false narrative and understanding than what really happened. So that, is there any shock in seeing all these so-called today to be educated means to be indoctrinated. That's it. And I'm sorry to say, as someone who likes, higher education, but if you're a part of this, the liberal arts, education now is indoctrination in bull. It's indoctrination in lies. It's indoctrination in the antithesis of truth. And the net result is that you get these people who come out feeling arrogant about what they know because they know what you don't know, and what they know is garbage. But they'll stick to it because they read it in a book, a garbage book. Okay, and so this is the unfortunate turn of events. Where academia and knowledge and the liberal arts went from open-mindedness and search for truth to where it's so controlled, it's so dogmatic, it's so indoctrinating, and it's all leftist, to use that word.
Yeah, we actually have a couple of questions along those lines. We have to sort of get through them. I don't know if you familiar with Craig Considine from Rice University.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, he's a guy who for years we've kind of been responding to articles he was posting. But his articles, so he's a professor of sociology. He's a professor of sociology at Rice University, but Muhammad's biggest fan of all time. Craig just seemed to love Muhammad more than Muslims do.
I thought that was Juan Cole, but okay.
But yeah, Considine for years, his articles would be like, it would basically make the argument that George Washington is basically the Muhammad of the United States, and then he would make his article comparing them how they're similar in all these ways. And he would talk about, he's a non-Muslim. He would say, here's why I believe that Muhammad is a prophet, even as a Catholic. And he's putting out all these articles constantly defending Muhammad. Muhammad is the best at this. He's one of the greatest people ever. But just very recently, you're talking like a couple of weeks ago, he started posting basically apologies on Twitter after years of this, saying that he had been collaborating with the Muslim Brotherhood and that he just thought he was doing something good because he'd absorbed the idea that that Islamophobia is the worst thing in the world and he has to combat it. And so he's viewing like the Muslim Brotherhood as an ally in combating this horrible thing called Islamophobia. And all of a sudden he realized that, wait, they're trying to use me for fundraising and trying to subjugate the United States and to use me to destroy Israel. Wait a minute. And then someone actually commented, wait a minute, you're a PhD scholar at Rice University and it took you until now to realize that the Muslim Brotherhood is bad and has these intentions? And his response was, better late than never, right? It's like, well, yeah, that is good. But I mean, it's just, that's the academic environment where these guys who are going and getting their degrees and so on, they're absorbing all this nonsense. And by the time they're finished, they view themselves as the good guys for going after people like you. They view themselves as the good guys because, yeah, this is wild stuff. These are insane times. But anyway, the point there was, it's actually possible. It's actually possible to get through to people. It's actually possible for people to realize, wait a minute, I've just spent 15 years on the totally wrong side of an issue. Ladies and gentlemen, people can learn. People can learn. And fortunately, they don't want to very frequently. So you gotta kind of make them.
Yep.
All right, let's take a few super chats here. Raymond, if you could WWE, so Russell, Muhammad, or Mike Winger, who would you fight?
Muhammad Hassan. I remember him. And by the way, I reject WWE. I call it WWF. I'm a purist like that.
I remember that. That's when I was a kid.
Yeah, I was older. So to me, it'll always be WWF. But I'm not sure. I know Muhammad Hassan, the guy who came out soon after 9/11 and was really controversial.
I think they're talking about the Prophet Muhammad.
Versus who?
If you had to pick between Prophet Muhammad or Mike Winger, who would you rather fight?
I must confess my ignorance. I don't know the prowess of Mike Winger.
And you have no idea how lucky you are. He's the worst person in the world.
Okay.
And no one here likes him.
Okay. I don't know who he is. So.
Good. You have no idea how blessed you are to not know that person. This is a question for me. Was that cross given to you in Windsor, David? Which one? This one? The one I'm wearing? No. I got that in a Christian bookstore a long time ago. Solaria says, I almost want to go as far as calling him a saint. This was an earlier comment, so I'm not sure what this is in response to. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe Solaria is thinking of when you're talking about Vlad the Impaler or something like that. I don't know.
Maybe.
Let's see. Just got both books on Audible. Latest was free. All right, so people are downloading your books from Audible.
If I can say about books, just because the two books really complement one another, and the older book, Sword and Scimitar, will give you the long history that we've been discussing Okay. The newer book, Defenders of the West, The Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam, covers the same terrain, but it's through the eyes and experiences of 8 heroes that I identify. So they're more like microbiographies of 8 different men. It seems like more people like it. It's more engaging and entertaining. But if you really want the more comprehensive, holistic history, you probably want to start with Sword and Scimitar. And if you like it, which you will, then you might want to go to Defenders of the West.
Ray, are you optimistic that Egypt will again be Christian?
I don't think so. I mean, hey, I don't know. I mean, for Egypt to become Christian, Islam would have to cease to be a force among men.
Well, let's make it happen.
Islam is more entrenched in Egypt than anywhere else. So if it gets overthrown in Egypt, that means it's been overthrown in the world. Okay, which hey, more power to everyone. But I'm more interested in seeing Islam. You know, I think there may be slightly more hope in seeing Islam defeated in, let's say, Minnesota. Slightly more hope. Okay.
BB says, is Islam at war with the West? Yes, indeed. Okay. Islam legitimately sounds like Satan worship. Muslims truly act demonic. Well, some certainly do. Tezbot says, I fear that people in the UK still not listening, getting into lots of arguments. Am I overreacting, or has UK gone too far? Has the UK gone too far? You think?
The UK, you know, it's such a sad commentary. It's like, you know, if people could speak the truth, and if they, what's happening in the UK is this, because there's been so much censorship and suppression and you can't say anything what you want, what happens is things start boiling over because you're not letting it simmer. You're not giving it ear. And now it's going to get worse because you tried to suppress it and you couldn't. Now it's going to blow up and now it's going to get ugly. Okay. And this is why free speech is so important and it should not be censored because it's a precursor to something worse. You know, if you don't have free speech, then it's not that it's going to go away. It's going to get ugly. It's going to get violent. Okay. And this is what these leftists don't get. And that's why they're in the situation where they're in right now.
Yeah. Years ago, I was just talking about this somewhere, but Anders Breivik, remember him? Went killed a bunch of people and so on. And people said, look at this guy. If I actually went through his manifesto that he posted online beforehand, his actual explanation for why he was doing this, he said, growing up in Norway, he was in an area that had lots of Muslim immigrants, and he started seeing how people were treated by these Muslims. And so he started thinking, hey, there's a problem here. So he says he started going to the Muslim sources. He started looking in the 80s, started going into the Muslim sources and seeing the problems. And he thought, hey, this is going to be a serious growing problem, and therefore I should go into politics. But then he said he eventually concluded that going into politics or journalism would be completely pointless because no matter what you say, they're just going to call you a racist. And so he says he gave up any sort of faith in speaking about this, talking about this, going into politics over this, doing journalism. He gave up hope in any of that. And he says he actually learned from Al-Qaeda. If you want to get your point across, you do a deadly shock attack. You just kill a bunch of people and all of a sudden you'll have people's attention. So my point here is that's what happens when people give up on any sort of peaceful means of going the political route or journalism route or even being able to speak. When all people are going to do is silence you, then people start, okay, nothing peaceful is going to work. Fine, I'll get violent. And then everyone goes, oh, what? Why'd this person get violent? Because he concluded that everything else is a waste of time. So right now, here in the U.S., if I have a problem, if some guy's going to come attack me or something like that, I can call the police and say, hey, police, come protect me from this person. If they're not doing their job, I could take the police to court. You could sue the police for doing the wrong thing and so on. But you can petition your leaders and so on. What happens if, as is the case in the UK, you get to the point where you think actually the government is trying to is on their side attacking us, and the journalists are all part of it too. And well, all I can do now is complain on YouTube or something like that. But oh wait, I'll get banned. And you've got the governments over there calling on social media platforms to silence these people who are talking about what's going on. Well, what do you think is going to happen when you completely obliterate any way these people have that's nonviolent, that's a way of dealing with their frustration? You say, nope, we're silencing you in every possible way. And then shocker that we're getting a violent reaction. But it's like common sense, people.
But I think, I completely agree with everything you said, but I think it's more sinister than that, because when the left wants this to happen, okay, this is the group that it was waiting for any excuse for a lockdown. All right. And when the right, and by the way, I hate using these terms, the right and left, they're so oversimplified and pathetic, but I have no choice because that's the common parlance. Okay, but when the right acts that way, even though it's justified, right, that gives the left all it needs to just enforce martial law and just shut everything down, censorship and everything. And that's the unfortunate aspect. But I'm not trying to say that people shouldn't rise up or shouldn't express themselves, but that's part of the game. Even when you do that, they win. Okay, yep. And that's because the whole thing is controlled. Okay. They got you by the balls. I mean, let me be honest with you. As long as you play by the paradigm, okay, the current political paradigm, you're going to lose, unfortunately, and it's set up that way. It doesn't matter who you vote for, if you're right or left, Democrat or Republican, or whatever the counterparts are in England and Europe. That's just part of the game, unfortunately. Okay, and when you do what you're doing, rising up and being violent and vocal, etc., that is going to give them the authority to just completely shut you down, throw you in jail, just like January 6th. It's the same sort of thing. So that's people need to understand it's far more complex now than just saying, okay, we've had enough and we're going to voice our opinion. I mean, that's what they want you to do, because then they'll really have power.
Yeah, so you're pointing out that what'll happen is, the government will be against you, police will be against you, journalists will be against you, and then you go out and you break something or vandalize something, and then those same institutions will say, see, the reason this person just did this bad thing is because of these dangerous ideas that are being spread on social media. That's why all these platforms need to crack down on anyone who's saying something we don't want. And that's why we need more laws against what people are allowed to say. And that's why we need to be arresting more people for what they say. And so, they push people until they react in a certain way. And then based on the reaction that they produced, that they caused, then they attack those people even more and use it to suppress them. So, Yep.
You got it. So what's happening in England is actually feeding right into what they want, because they're giving them the pretext to completely, push their full weight of the law and just, censorship, lockdowns, curfews, you name it.
All right, we've got a little short amount of time left. Let's burn through some of these super chats, and then we'll give our final thoughts. And let's see. It would help if history teachers would just say Islam when they mean Islam instead of using euphemism, code speech. Some of us are dummies and need you to spell it out. Yeah, so instead of saying Islamism or something like this, then David, please check out the video "Why I'm Determined to Expose Islam" by Naomi Armstrong. I will. If I forget, then remind me. Let's see. The English flag's red cross is the cross of St. George. Before George became a rock star in the Roman army, he was born a Turk. Was he a Turk or was he a Greek?
He was a Cappadocian, which predates the Turkish conquest of Asia Minor, so that's anachronistic.
Yeah, so it's what is currently Turkey, but he was a Greek
Right.
in what is now
Right.
Turkey. Okay.
Yes.
Is this Islamic attempt to take over the West due to the majority of the people in the West turning their backs on God and bring us more and more out of his protection and instead bring us under a curse? So we're just thinking, lots of people are thinking of it in, even if you're examining the situation, it's, well, people are dumb. But Lloyd here is asking, is there a spiritual issue here? Like you turn away from God and he just says, okay, I'm not going to protect you here anymore. In other words, is it similar to the Old Testament where the Israelites are surrounded by these other groups, and if they turned away from God, he would let the groups come in and
yeah. No, I get it. Yeah, I think so. I think that element is plausible and valid. But you can understand it how. But in my opinion, it's because once you turn your back from the Christian ethos and the mores, then you're in a vacuum. This is what leads to relativism, which is what leads to things that are euphemistically called multiculturalism, which is another form of relativism, which means you have nothing to live for. Everyone has something to live for. Muslims have a way. They want to live according to it. Everyone has it, but you don't. And therefore, since you have nothing to live for except material and hedonism, you must acquiesce to their way. Maybe they know something better after all. You have nothing. So I think, I'm putting aside the theological argument, which I think is valid and which I ascribe to. But I'm trying to use a more secular argument, which is in a vacuum where you have no belief, something will fill it. And you have no impetus to fight back if you have no particular belief. Muslims, in our opinion, are wrong. Their belief is invalid, but it's still a belief, and look at how much strength and inspiration it gives them. So imagine if Christians who have the truth actually believed it and acted upon it, how fierce they would become. And we already know how, because we have history that most people don't know.
Yeah, so basically two ways of looking at things, Lloyd, that Raymond just went through. So, I mean, keep in mind, we don't know the mind of God, so we don't know if God is actually sitting there going, hey, I'm going to let this group come in and do this because these people turned against me. You can make that case and believe that. So that's one way to go about things. You can make that case and you can draw parallels with the Israelites and so on. But there's a different case that any atheist right now could actually understand. If you, let me put it this way. If you have a group that has sort of stood the test of time, whatever that may be, they've stood the test of time. They've been invaded, they've been conquered, they've been reconquered, and they're still there. They last. There's something about that group that is making it last. So I'm not even talking about true or false right now. You talk about Hindus in India. Okay, they were conquered by all kinds of groups. There's something about Hinduism that is making it last longer than other things are lasting. The Jews were conquered by everyone. Who was there that didn't conquer the Jews at some point? The Jews somehow lasted. So there's something there. Same thing with Christians. Again, we were talking about it earlier. For 14 centuries, Christians said, hey, we are going to resist that. And they did. All of a sudden, you take that away and, we're begging to be conquered and subjugated. Even as an atheist, you should step back and say, wait a minute, maybe there's something there that makes it psychologically strong when other bad ideas come along. And maybe by abandoning that, we're giving up whatever it was that helped these people resist that thing. In other words, if you're one of the new atheists who said, hey, let's just get rid of Christianity and everything will become a scientific utopia, you should be rethinking that really, really seriously right now. Because what actually happened, you didn't get your scientific utopia. You just got a bunch of Christians not taking Christianity very seriously anymore. And then all of a sudden you completely lost your backbone as far as standing against Islam. So I don't know. I'd be rethinking things at this point.
May I augment that with a 1-minute commentary?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so basically, here at the bottom, I mean, to answer that same question, which you did very ably, but in a very short, simple way, Christendom from the 8th all the way to, let's say, the 16th century which is Europe at this point because it already got conquered elsewhere, is so weak compared to the vast Muslim empires. And it did everything possible. And this is especially my book, Defenders of the West, where kings and emperors and nobles sacrificed their lives simply to keep Islam out of Europe. But they were weaker. They were materially, fiscally, economically, and so forth, weaker, believe it or not, than the Muslim empires, which were humongous. They were behemoths, and they managed. Now, flip the coin to today. Europe, the West, is economically, militarily behemoth compared to the Muslim world. And yet, here you have Muslims doing what their ancestors could not do. Why is that? And I think it's because the former Christians had something to fight for. Okay, they had their religion, their faith, their heritage, their culture, their family. All right. Today's Europeans, yeah, they have the might, they have the physical, military, economic power and pressure, but they have nothing to live for. They have nothing to resist. So they just capitulate left and right, as we're seeing today.
So all you atheists and secularists who thought we can actually do this better and we know what we're doing and we just need to get rid of all the stupid Christianity, you are actually standing on the shoulders of giants and you didn't realize it. And hopefully you're learning a lesson. You're learning a valuable lesson right now. Let's see. Isaiah 53 says, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Amen. What do you think of the view that Islam was adopted later by the Arab conquerors, or that Islam was still developing 100 years after Muhammad died? So, not sure.
I think it's no, I'm familiar with it. I think it's a moot point. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what happened historically. What matters is what Muslims believe. Okay, and Muslims believe in the traditional historiography. Muhammad, born in 570, spoke to Gabriel around 610, got the Quran, etc., etc. Okay, so that's what really matters. So much of history we can't really piece. It's all conjectural, including this idea that, you know, Islam was manufactured much later by, I don't know, the Umayyads or the Abbasids. And in fact, I've always, I've taken umbrage with that particular argument for one strong reason. I think it was developed by Patricia Crone in her book Hagarism, which is, it argues that Muhammad, I don't know, didn't exist, or, the whole hagiography about him came about 200 years later. And I think the flaw with that argument, and by the way, I believe that, the hadith and all that, and the comprehensive idea, I don't know that, I'm not saying that's accurate. That might be full of flaws too. But I do believe in the central story of a prophet, Muhammad, etc. And I'll tell you why. But the number one reason that I don't believe it is, if Islam was created and fabricated, okay, by the Umayyads or the Abbasids, whoever it is, 200 years after Muhammad, how do you understand the Shia-Sunnah split? The Shia-Sunnah split is inherently based on Muhammad and his family. Okay, the Shias say that the successor should have been Ali, which is his cousin and who married Muhammad's daughter Fatima. So they're, it's to them it's a family thing. Whereas the Sunnis said no, it's whoever is the best qualified, caliph, whoever that would be, Omar, Abu Bakr, etc. Okay, so if this was a created story, where did this split come from that still exists till this day and they're killing each other? Did someone also create that and create a lie and say, hey, you Sunnis, there's a Shia in here? I mean, that just doesn't make sense. But more to the point, as far as 634, we have, small parchments and which I think are very relevant, of, there's a Jewish scribe who talks about a prophet who has risen in Arabia, and he doubts he doubts that he's a prophet because prophets don't come in chariots. I mean, that's pretty early. That's contemporaneous with Muhammad. So I think it's safe to say there was a figure, whatever his name was, Muhammad, which I know could be an epithet or whatever, an Arabian prophet figure that arose and who really crystallized tribalism, jihad, us against them. And then, but as far as the rest of the of the hadith and so forth, yeah, obviously, I don't know which. I know they have their Sahih, which is the authentic ones, canonical ones, and not. And that also may be bunk. But I think in the broad outlines, yes, you had a prophet in that era who came up with essentially a divisive doctrine. Okay. And like I said, to me, the Sunni Shia thing, I've never heard anyone address that. How could the Sunni Shia split happen unless there was a prophet who had descendants and who had non-descendants fighting for rule of the Islamic world, for the caliphate? How could that also be fabricated?
Yeah, I have a similar perspective in that I believe I believe the sort of basic outline of the figure
Yeah.
of this Arabian self-proclaimed prophet. In fact, I've debated Jay Smith and Robert Spencer, are two of the guys who don't think that Muhammad existed. So I debated both of them, and it is hard because you're not dealing with a lot of early sources, and you do have issues like not finding Mecca on the maps and so on. And I mean, Muhammad in the Muslim sources, he's challenging all the empires and stuff, and empires at the time, they usually haven't heard of him, and so on. So it's actually hard to argue. But my argument was, hey, if someone later is inventing this guy to be the center of their new religion because they recognize, hey, we need something that makes us strong like Christians, I just go down the list of all these things that no one would invent. Why would you invent this? Why would you invent a story
Yeah,
about him?
a lot of it is so like unflattering to him.
Yeah, the satanic verses. I mean, yeah, he was so
Yeah,
dumb.
yeah.
He delivered
Why would
revelations
you?
from Satan.
If I'm I'm pro Muhammad. I want to foist this, this fabrication. Why would I give you very negative, unflattering hadiths about him? I mean, that's just one of it. But to me, like I said, the Sunni Shia split. This is a real thing. We see it today. They're killing each other. Okay, and it's fundamentally based on the existence of a prophet and his descendants. So how can that not have been? But hey, long story short, I don't think it really matters. What matters is what Muslims believe, and that's the end of it.
Yeah. So the takeaway here, Lily, is Raymond and I and many others, for various reasons, we think the overarching general story is authentic. Yes, later hadiths, obviously, lots of because they're so late, lots of people were inventing things. Yes, that's true. Yeah. But to be fair, there are some difficulties that the skeptics will raise, and I'm talking about like Christian skeptics who are skeptical about the sources. And so they actually have a case that they can make, and I'm totally fine with them making their case wherever they can, because that's how you get closer and closer to the truth. And the end result of that is you find out more and more of what's been made up and what's authentic. But as Raymond's pointing out, it kind of doesn't affect like the practical implications of that worldview. If you have a ton of people who believe that this guy commanded them, because he'd been commanded by God to violently subjugate the world, kind of doesn't matter what you think about the historical validity of this. So anyway, that's a couple of issues there, and hope that helps.
It also has, unfortunately, this is one of the reasons I don't like this thesis. It has the unfortunate ramification of making Westerners and non-Muslims take Islam lightly, as if it's built on a bunch of collapsible cards, and one day or the other Muslims are going to figure out it's fake, and so hey, it's a matter of time. And no, it's a serious 14th century old threat. It's not going to go away that easily.
Tezbot here says, any enlightening thoughts on the history of Palestine? Don't know if that's an area you want to go into, or
no, not at this late hour. We got a few minutes.
Yep. We stupidly see Jerusalem as Westerners. Not sure what you mean. Is we're seeing it as Westerners, or we're seeing Jerusalem as if they're Westerners? Not sure what you mean there. Lely here again says, what is the origin of the Muslim leftist alliance? How do these groups justify working with those who are opposed to them on nearly every principle? This is a question that comes up over and over and over again. Why do you have this group marching side by side with Muslims when we all know that Muslims would destroy this group?
That's very easy to me, because to the left, and again, I hate that word, I'd rather call them Satanists or abominations. But to those people, you know, their primary enemy is Christianity, Christian ethics, Christian civilization, Christian mores, and they will go to bed with anyone who is a proven enemy. And who's the greatest and most historical, formidable nemesis of Christianity? It's Islam. They know that. And so, you know, they bring them in, they support them, and then they let them run amok and destroy churches in Europe, do what they're doing. And I mean, look at what's happening in England. They're going to protect the Muslims, not, you know, the little girls who are being killed. So I think the alliance is fundamentally, it's their foot soldiers. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the left sees Muslims. But the Muslims, I can tell you, have nothing but absolute contempt for the left. They hate them because they are the antithesis of everything they believe. They're homosexuals, they're depraved, they're effete, they're emasculate, you know, they're pathetic. So they use them in as much as they can. And in fact, and you see a break and a rift within the alliance all the time, such as in that one in Dearborn or in Michigan, the Muslim majority city Hamtramck, I think, where all the leftists empowered the Muslims, and now you have a Muslim majority city council, and the first thing they do is ban pride celebrations.
Yeah, and then you saw the reaction. Well, what? We supported you. Why aren't you supporting us? Well, because we viewed you as useful idiots, and we never intended in supporting you. It was all it was all part of the plan. A state up here in India, banned halal certification. Interesting. Solaria says, yes, I meant Vlad the Impaler earlier when Solaria was talking about viewing Vlad as a saint. Once Islam entrenches itself in a society, it will never be dislodged. The British may protest, but Islam thrives in this kind of confrontation. Islam thrives in the confrontation when it encounters weakness and ignorance. That's what it does. What does Ray think about the avalanche of apostasy? You familiar with this? I don't know, because you focus on the history, but basically they're calling it, they named it the avalanche of apostasy, where basically the apostasy rate of young Muslims went from close to 0% like 20 years ago to 24% as of a few years ago. And so,
no, that's a real thing. And in fact, it is probably the most potent tool if you want to be cynical or if you want to be a Christian and sincere. It's the most potent tool in disarming Islam. You know, Muslims are religious people. You're not gonna talk them out of what they believe by telling them to embrace secular humanism. They need a substitute that is theological and theistic centered. Okay, and so that would become Christianity. And in fact, historically, that's what it was. When Muslims, I mean, you have Muslims who apostatize and become atheists, yes. But the vast majority in the Islamic world become Christian because they need an alternative. They need something to fill the vacuum. It's good to believe in God, even if he's Allah. That is better than believing in nothing and nihilism. Okay, but when you're a Muslim and you have that and you feel like there's problems, as we're discussing, there's something not right here, and then you see there's a Christian God, okay, well, now you have an alternative. Now you have something viable, as opposed to feeding them with, hey, you either be a Muslim or become some depraved sexual leftist, hedonist pedophile. Obviously, they don't want that to their credit. Okay, so I do believe that, from a cynical point of view, preaching Christianity is actually very advantageous to breaking the backbone of Islam. But as a Christian, I also think it's a good thing because it saves Muslim souls.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because Ayan Hirsi Ali converted recently, but she was saying that even when she was an atheist, she was saying, you guys who want to deal with Islam, you might be better off helping the Christians go preach to them than just by preaching atheism to them. Oh my goodness, this Raymond is so much better than the one from the show. Everybody loves Raymond, especially me. Pamela says, thank you, D. Wood. Raymond Ibrahim, I bought both your books, and D. Wood, I bought your cool shirt. Is there a translation of it that can be downloaded? Yeah, we might work on that. I made a shirt that's covered in Arabic Quran verses, and it says checkmate jihadis on the front. And I wore it to Speaker's Corner. So the idea was you can't stab me because you'd have to stab the Quran. So anyway, and then people started requesting it. So I went ahead and put it in a little store where people can get it.
I'll have to get one.
All right. Well, I told you 2 hours, so I'm gonna read this question. You can answer this question, and then if you want to cut out, you can cut out. I'm gonna stay and answer a few more questions in the super chat. But Countess here says, "What's the solution? I'm a university student. It's been hard."
On a university student,
Yeah,
it's hard?
Yeah, said, "What's the solution? I'm a university student.
Oh.
It's been hard."
Oh, well, of course it's been hard. You're in college. You're being indoctrinated in garbage. So I understand that. So I guess the first step is to realize what I just said, which is you are on enemy territory and their job is to brainwash you. So guard your brain is the first step. Second, ascertain and acquire accurate knowledge, which is not as easy as it seems because everything around you is false and lies. I don't want to toot my own horn, but if you're interested in these topics, look into my books because they are objective. Both of them have about 1,000 footnotes from primary sources, Defenders of the West, Sword and Scimitar. If you're interested in those, particular topics, which I think really form the basis of what we're discussing. It's not doctrine, it's history. History is the manifestation of doctrine. And I think that's more important than just abstract doctrine in the air. But I understand your point, young person. So just try to disassociate yourself from the indoctrination, which I think instinctively you may understand, and look to and try to read and find more listen to your senses, listen to your instinct, what jibes with you and what makes sense. Because I think that's one of the worst things that's happened to us modern folk is we've been so taught to deny our instinct and our common sense. But, try to listen to your instinct and common sense. It's more right than wrong, especially in the current context.
All right. Well, again, I told you 2 hours, so if you want to cut out, you can go. I know you have other stuff to do. I'm going to continue with a few more questions. But thanks, Raymond Ibrahim. Again, everyone, definitely check out the books. This is not just for your personal, private edification. This is like world-changing stuff. If people do not become informed about the basic history and so on, I don't see a path forward for the entire West. So that's how important it is. It's like D-Day level stuff, ladies and gentlemen. But instead of like storming beaches, you just got to grab some books and actually learn stuff, and then go out and make sure everyone else knows. So thanks to Raymond for joining us. And anytime you want to jump on and share something, Raymond, open invitation.
Thank you very much, David. I had a great time, and we'll do it again. You take care.
All right. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
All right. A few more super chats, ladies, and then I'll be out as well. Joshua says, please pray for Bangladeshi Hindus and Christians. Yeah, things are going really, really terribly right now in Bangladesh, as far as I can tell. Open season. I haven't seen too much about what's going on with Christians there, but I know it's been open season on Hindus, and a lot of people aren't even paying attention to it because they're focused on what's going on in the UK. So, yeah. I don't know. Seems like bad situations all over the place right now with Islam. Joshua says, just to give props to Thomas Jefferson, you are correct that he was wrong at first about Muslims. He ran for president on forming the Marines and a Navy to take them out. So yeah, that's another example of people can learn and change their positions. I'm looking to seek asylum somewhere else. UK over. Yeah, just imagine if like every place Islam goes, everyone there has to seek asylum from other places. And then even the Muslims in the area have to seek asylum because they're from the wrong sect of Islam and they're persecuted too. So they have to go somewhere else. And you wonder, like, if the UK, keep in mind, I don't think the UK is actually going to collapse to Islam, but suppose it did. Like, even then, would people still catch on? Or would it be like, oh yeah, well, that's just an unfortunate thing, but that's not real Islam. Real Islam is what's coming for you, Canada. And then if Canada converted to Islam or was forcibly converted to Islam? Are other nations still going to say, well, yeah, that's how it worked for 14 centuries, and that's how it worked in UK and Canada and France. But, hey, USA, just open your hearts to these jihadis. It's like, what? Like, how stupid can we possibly be? Eliyahu says, many of those Middle Eastern Christians despise Chalcedonians, Constantinople, who treated them harshly, and in many cases, like Egypt, barely resisted the tide of Islam, hoping it would be a better regime. That's an ongoing problem as well, that you can view Islam as an ally to take out something else that you are not a fan of, thinking that Islam is going to be better. And it just never is. Whatever you don't like about whatever's going on in your society, Islam is not the solution to it. Eliyahu says, my point is that if they were not so fractured, Middle Eastern Christians could potentially stand a chance against Islam. Panchman says, did you ever find my email? I can resend. Yes, I did. Yes, I just checked for your email a little bit ago and saw that it is not indeed under the name Panch Schmantz, but that was included in your email. So yeah, I saw it. Lloyd says, thanks for responding. I don't believe God is sending Islam. I think that so many people who turned from God are spiritually blinded and deaf to the truth, and it might take a spiritual battle first for them to even be able to hear the truth you both speak. And that is the positive side, is that if people are asleep and you're trying to give them some information, they refuse, Islam will keep pushing until they wake up. In other words, Islam is going to startle people out of their sleep. And so, guys, there are a lot of people listening who weren't listening 5 years ago. So learn some stuff and then share it. Is Galatians 1:8 and Luke 19:41-44 legitimate prophecy about Muhammad and Islam? Well, you've got warnings about false teachers, false prophets, false gospels, and so on. I'm not thinking specifically. I don't think these are like specifically about Muhammad and Islam. There are certain patterns that false teachers, false prophets follow. I have to say that if you talk about beware of false prophets, they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves, and you will know them by their fruits. I mean, that talks about a lot of false prophets, but I have to say Muhammad is like the supreme example. I mean, show me a greater example of someone who came along, hey, Christians, Jews, I'm on your side, and later on, I have to subjugate you. Wolf in sheep's clothing, like perfect. And then know them by their fruits. Look at the fruit. Look at the fruit of both Muhammad and the religion that came from him. So I think that Muhammad is kind of the supreme example of like the concept of a false prophet, in that, not just in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament as well. And let's see, last one here. Loaves of Bread said, AP should connect Ray with Michaela Peterson about teaching Islamic history for Peterson Academy. That is Loaves of Bread. Bring that up again when AP is on here, because that is a good suggestion. And AP, since he has done a show with Michaela, has her contact info. So that would actually be a very good connection. And the Jordan Peterson of 2 or 3 years ago might not have been interested in that back when he was, hey, get a pen pal, everyone will get along fine. Now Jordan Peterson is, looks like he's starting to realize very quickly what he's actually dealing with. And so lots of people are going to be in that situation. So guys, as horrible and awful as the situation is, when you look around and see all the messed up things that are going on in the world, these are actually good times for people waking up. And so these are good times for spreading important information that needs to be shared. So it's very simple. Depending on how much time you have available, because there are different people who have different amounts of time. Use whatever time you have available, that whatever time you can actually dedicate to what's going on in the world. Use that time effectively to learn some important information and share that important information wherever you can. Guys, that's just how it works. If every person who knows something actually communicated it to one other person, you've just doubled the number of informed people. If you learn one thing and you share it with 10 people who didn't know it, you have just done something very, very helpful. If 10,000 people each share something with 10 people or 100 people, all of a sudden, civilization becomes massively better informed. Islam, historically, when Islam cannot spread by the sword, it only spreads in an atmosphere of ignorance. It takes advantage of people's ignorance. So Islam is not in a good position to conquer the world militarily right now. Their militaries are backwards compared to Western militaries. That means they can only spread it right now by taking advantage of people's ignorance. So if you want to take away the only advantage Islam has right now, which is the atmosphere of ignorance, just do away with the atmosphere of ignorance by becoming informed. And Islam will not be able to stand against an informed population of free people. Thank you for joining, and we will catch you all next time. For those of you who are channel members, there is a video that is, it's in a share. Oh, I forgot about this. What? Hey, what's this? What does this one do? I forgot what this one did. Hey, what does this do? It did something once. There we go. Fireworks. That's the fireworks. For those of you who are channel members, there is a video that is in the community post. It's a members-only community post. So that'll be live for everyone else tomorrow. So that's my video for tomorrow morning. But if you didn't see it earlier and you're a channel member, it's actually in the community post. You can check that out right now if you want to. Apart from that, so new video in the morning, and then we'll be... I think it'll be This Week in Jihad tomorrow night with Robert. Not sure what the plan is with AP, but I'm sure we've got some, well, I'm sure we'll be live here very soon because there's a lot to discuss about all the crazy stuff that's going on in the world. All right, everyone. I'll catch you next time.